All right. Hi everyone. So this is my first stream. So the internet connection might be a little wonky. You might hear some background noises, but that's okay. We'll proceed ahead. So, anyways, I'm kind of working on an open source project, which is an IDE, which is a Flutter IDE. And I was like, okay, if this is an open source project, why don't I kind of build it in front of everyone um, in a truly open source fashion. So I was like, what's the best way to do it? And okay, maybe let's start doing small YouTube live, and that's how maybe I can kind of reach out to other people who are interested in it. But anyways, yeah, that's where we are. So why why I'm building an ID? I mean, if there is Android Studio out there, if there is VS Code out there, well, I think for a long, I've been developing apps for a while, and I think majority of times what I feel is either way writing code that's kind of repetitive, mundane. So, say for example, if I'm displaying or if I'm building a UI which has to display some lists, I mean, most of the time I have built this list hundreds of times, right? So I don't particularly enjoy that part. I was like, I wish I could just kind of copy paste this from somewhere, and or maybe is there a way to kind of reuse this somewhere, right? Like, I'm not reinventing a wheel here from scratch. So I was like, okay, is there a way where I can or maybe can IDs be smart enough where I can kind of drag and drop like the stuff that's kind of very easy, and then the time that I save by doing this, I can invest in kind of improving the app, improving the performance, improving the user experience, right? And of course, you might say, well, there is no code. There are a lot of no code tools out there that kind of let you do that. But the problem there is key. A lot of these no code tools actually operate in a very tight ecosystem, and most of the time it's a proprietary ecosystem, right? So um, I can't take away my code and go to some other no code tool, or maybe just use it in some other ID or whatever, if I'm not happy with the direction the current no code tool is going, right? Or maybe if tomorrow the no code tool suddenly decides to change their pricing and I'm kind of screwed there, right? I can't just snap a finger and move from one tool to other tool. I mean, that's very difficult to do. And that's how, like, can an ID be like a hybrid ID, right? An ID where I can kind of drag and drop maybe the UI, right? And then I can kind of also have the control and the freedom to kind of change the code, maybe change the state management, change uh, certain aspects of the UI, right? If I'm not happy with the way it's looking, right, so can there be an ID which is like hybrid, which is like a no code, but also kind of lets me write the code where I want to, right? And then, yeah, I mean, I was kind of not so I was okay with Android Studio. I wish it could do a lot of things in a different way. I tried using VS Code. I mean, the thing I hated about Android Studio was that it was extremely heavy. I mean, it took as the project kind of grew, it kind of got expensive on my system, and I'm using an M1 here, right? So I was like, is there a better way? Maybe I and then give VS Code a shot, and then I mean, VS Code is a lightweight tool, but it's a I really couldn't get much out of it that at least I was getting through Android Studio, right? And the more I kind of started working on and the more I kind of kept working on this project, I felt like there has to be a new ID, which is kind of like a which actually takes care of the mundane, the repetitive code that we end up writing. Maybe it just kind of lets me drag and drop the UI stuff. Maybe if I'm integrating a payment gateway, every time I kind of implement the same stuff, and maintaining it kind of gets difficult over time. Can I just plug and play the payment gateway? So I was kind of thinking along these lines, and I finally reached to a conclusion. Maybe I can build an ID which is kind of low code, right? Which lets me drag and drop my UI, um, and also lets me take control, take charge, and write the code wherever necessary, which is lightweight. That sounds like, yeah, that'd be a fun exercise to build an open source ID, which is kind of best of the both worlds, the no code world and the of course the coding world. And yeah, here we are. So I'm kind of doing this YouTube live session to kind of just yeah, document this exercise, learn along the way, and perhaps maybe see if other people are interested to contribute. So here we are. Now that's kind of a quick overview of what I'm up to. Now getting back into today's coding session, right? So if you take a look at an ID, like this is your ID, right? It has bunch of tools that kind of help you kind of get more out of it than a normal text editor or a code editor would do, right? So it'll have some functionalities around debugging. It'll have some functionalities around code analysis, around testing, or just things of that nature, which will kind of help you a little bit in your productivity, right? And one of those aspects is this file tree browser, right? So far, if you look at the progress I've made, which is something I've just kind of recently started on this project. So the progress isn't significant, but what I've been able to achieve is that I've been able to set up a basic layout here, where I see that on the left hand side, I can have all the tools, which is this file browser. Now, since this is a Flutter specific IDE, right? So you see widget tree, you see this git commit history, this is the settings, and this is the editor menu, and these are where you will have your buttons for debugging, testing, performance profiling, stuff like that, right? So now the progress I've made is that I have been able to kind of select a project, right? So okay, you opened up the ID, now you want to kind of select a project that you want to work on. So this is what it lets you do, right? It lets you select a project. So I already have a project lying around here, which is a Flutter project, so I'm going to select that, right? In this scenario, I've used the file picker APIs in Flutter, which are cross-platform, so I don't have to really worry about implementing it for every platform. And that's the one thing I love about Flutter, that it's cross-platform. It really gets me down to the business, right? I don't have to worry about a lot of things that will essentially end up eating time from my project, which I can just spend on improving the experience, right? So yeah, I mean that's one thing I like about Flutter, and all the things that the Flutter team has been doing in that direction. Just hot reload and stuff like that have really added great ton of value, right? So anyways, getting back to the point, I select a working directory, right? So once I do that, it quickly shows all the files that are available in my project, and I can kind of expand, collapse, um, and open the source code file that I want to work on, right? And this is the lib directory, based on, so this is where all my Flutter source code is stored, right? So I'm gonna open and expand that directory, and then I can select a file to kind of work on top of it, right? So as you see, you can quickly open up this editor, and I can kind of browse through it, and I can edit the code, right? Now, again, for both of these functionalities, to quickly get them up to speed, I have used a library here to display these files in a hierarchy manner, and to have this expand collapse functionality, which is amazing. And I would momentarily show that library to amazing library. And then again, I have used another plugin, which is a text editor widget that's available on pub.dev. Now it kind of does the basic stuff, but of course, as we kind of go dive down deep into um, essential implementation, we'll see how we can improve this, and how we can do all the fancy stuff that Android Studio and VS Code does, right? Which is code completion, error analysis, stuff like that. So we'll kind of do, and that should be an exciting thing to learn, I think. So yeah, I mean, I think the highlighting is not that great. I love I don't like the highlighting that Android Studio has. I actually really love how VS Code does, and I think maybe some people would just find it daunting because there are so many colors. But I really like, let me say, for example, open up a source code file. Maybe this has a lot of code. Yeah, there you go. So I really like how VS Code actually does syntax highlighting, code highlighting, which is amazing. And I think we'll try to see if we could do the same what VS Code has done. But at least for now, what I'm trying to achieve is that this file tree, I want to, this is already now in a working state. I'm pretty happy with it, but there are certain enhancements I want to do, and that is what we'll try to do today. So that's that. Now, another thing that I've implemented is the responsiveness, right? So if I try to kind of minimize or try to reduce, automatically this file tree gets hidden, this tool gets hidden, right? So that's one thing that I've implemented, again with the help of a widget, an amazing widget that I'd like to introduce you to all today. That's that. And then there is this thing which kind of hides and shows the project tree. Now if you see, there's a I mean, there's one more enhancement that remains to be done, which is like, when I hide this, this thing, this area that it occupies also should get eliminated. And maybe I haven't used the widget, the visibility widget correctly, and I've only used it on this widget and not this whole collapsing widget. So we'll try to kind of fix that, and we'll also, other thing we'll try to do is, so that's goal number one. And goal number two is if I expand this thing, right, and I close this Project Explorer, and when I open it, I seem to be losing this expand and collapse state, right? So that's what we'll try to do. We'll try to maintain that this expand collapse state actually stays there, right? So I'm kind of not losing the mood here. Um, but there you go. Now let's kind of quickly dive down how I've built this and how we can improve this, right? Now coming back to Android Studio, hopefully someday we'll be using our own IDE to write uh, this code, but up until that point, Android Studio will do, right? And by the way, I would encourage you to kind of check out our GitHub repository. I haven't done much, not a lot of functionalities have been added, but I'd be happy if you could show us some love, star it, maybe suggest some features, and if possible, if you could contribute, that'd be great. Get in touch with me. I'll help you get this project started, and I'll kind of get you up to speed. So that'd be amazing if you could contribute to the project, right? So anyways, I think that's good for now. Let's kind of dive down and see how this project tree has been implemented, and how we can improve it so that it maintains that expand and collapse state. So we'll figure this thing out together. I'm kind of also learning Flutter on and off, but this time I think, yeah, I think we'll go all in, all the way through. Right? So anyways, if you see the library that I'm using here to display this tree is Fancy Tree View, Flutter Fancy Tree View, right? So if you kind of go to their project, um, what amazing about this library compared to the other tree view implementations is that it has its own controller, which kind of lets me expand, collapse individual nodes or all the nodes, right? And I think that's a functionality that's there in other libraries too. But the other thing I like about it is that this thing actually lets you load data asynchronously, and perhaps the functionality is there in other libraries, but I just didn't have a good documentation for the other libraries. So I'm like, okay, whatever is easier to kind of understand and implement soon, I'd pretty much do that. And plus, I think the maintainer of this library is very much available on, or very much active on the community, on the GitHub. So that's amazing. So big ups to Matthews. So I actually posted a one thing that I had, and he pretty much got on top of the issue and helped me out. So that's great. But yeah, so this is the library that we'll be using. It's a simple library, if I'm being honest. There's not a lot of things that are complicated about it, and all kudos to Matthews. But yeah, same concept. You kind of initiate a controller so that you can kind of use that controller to control your tree, expand couple of nodes, set their root, set how these children are loaded. And this is the amazing part, right? So here, when I initialize this tree controller, I can set up some roots to it, like the initial zero level, because tree is kind of in a hierarchy. So uh, the first time I kind of define that tree, I would like to set its roots, and that's what this library allows me to do. So when I set up the controller. I'm going to define the roots, and then I can fetch the child providers. So there is this method called as children provider, where I can write a getter that will actually fetch the children of the node that I'm expanding, right? So that's an amazing thing that this library kind of does, right? And then once you have your controller in place, you can use their animated tree widget, pass the controller, and have a node builder, right? Which will actually build the tree at a given level, right? So when you first kind of get this widget initialized, and when it builds first, it will build the root level, and then as you go on expanding, it will kind of try to build every that specific level, right? So that's kind of amazing, right? And there is also a demo app, right? So we'll kind of check out that demo app, and we'll see how it behaves. Now, I don't have the fanciest internet connection, unfortunately, at the moment, but we'll see. Okay, we'll see. Yeah, so this is it. I'm gonna get to lazy loading because I feel like either way, the file picker API has async methods to read a directory or to read a file. Right? So either way, the data I'm going to be reading is asynchronous. That's why I was kind of looking out for a tree implementation that has asynchronous fetching logic. So there you go. This library has that, right? So if I kind of it has a lot of other things. I can enable disable control. I can set up indentation levels. I can do a lot of other customization on how on the way this tree looks. So this is kind of my root directory, and it expands. And there is a loader also, so it expands asynchronously as soon as the data is fetched. So that's amazing, right? And then I can kind of collapse, and I can again expand, and yeah. So there you go, right? Okay, amazing. So I think what I've done is I've implemented this thing, but what I've not done is if uh, I would like to retain this state, this expanded state whenever I rebuild the widget in the same session. Because whenever you're working in an IDE, you kind of open a couple of files because you're kind of working on different. You're working on some feature or some functionality, and your logic resides in one directory. Your UI or your views reside in other directory. Your data model, so you have logically arranged your source tree structure for some pattern. So naturally you'll have your files in different directories. What you want to do is you want to be able to kind of hide that project structure if you want a better view to your code base. But when you reopen that, it is expected that the tree structure kind of is retained, right? So you're not lost. You don't find yourself lost around an insanely complicated project structure, right? So that's what we're kind of aiming here, right? So I'll show how I have implemented this stuff. Right? So of course I've got added the dependency fancy tree view. Right now, before I kind of dive down, maybe I should mention that I'm using Riverpod for state management. For folks who are using provider or something else, maybe Riverpod would be a bit strange. I know it was certainly strange for me when I first learned it, but I have absolutely loved it since. And I have rarely find myself using stateful widgets after that. And and, and that led to a funny incident. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I'm using Riverpod here, right? So what I've done is, so this is kind of my IDE, right? And on button click, what I do is I actually created a new provider, which actually is of string, and it actually stores the directory of the project, right? And and I'm kind of reading that or watching that provider again in this widget, this project explorer. And whenever that project directory gets updated or gets changed, this uh, widget actually gets rebuilt. And that's the beauty of provider, I actually can use a dependency or a provider anywhere in my project and have it respond to the changes without really writing a lot of code. And that's kind of amazing. And that's what river pod lets me do it. It lets me kind of set a provider and store that file directory from here whenever someone selects it, right? So if I click here, I pick a project location, and then automatically this thing gets rebuilt, right? So if I read that same provider here, it'll see if the value has changed, and if it has changed, it'll rebuild the whole tree, right? So again, a disclaimer, I'm kind of learning, so maybe if I say something wrong, do correct me. Yeah, so there you go. Anyways, so let me kind of show you that structure, right? So if you look at my source tree, this is where I have stored all my hooks. We'll come to that later. People from React might know what hooks are. I didn't, certainly I'm not from React, so this kind of like a new territory for me. This is where I have stored all my localization. Again, perhaps a talk for some other day. This is where I'm stored my data models, and this is where all my providers are, right? So the provider which actually captures and stores the project directory is this, right? So if you see, what I've done is I've defined the class. I think this provider, this specific type of provider, is of the type change notifier. So what this does is basically, maybe we should just kind of look at riverpod, right? So certainly if you're not, if you're new to riverpod, or if you've never used a state provider, I think this is worth a shot. And maybe there are some great tutorials out there that explains how riverpod works. But for this discussion, what we'll do, we'll kind of just quickly get understand this thing through some analogy, and I'll at least try to explain uh, with what I understand about this thing, right? So let's take a look at what I have implemented, right? Um, this thing will load. Anyways, so what I've done is I've actually and because Flutter is the reason why one thing Flutter is fun is because it has a lot of code generation tactics, right? So in this scenario, what I've done is and even Riverpod has this functionality of code generation, so I don't have to write a lot of boilerplate code. I just used a couple of annotations and we are good to go, right? So that's pretty amazing in that respect. So what I've done is I've kind of defined a small provider. That provider is supposed to uh, essentially watch over a data type of string, and whenever that essentially data changes, it will notify all the other widgets that are watching there, right? So if you look at this example where they have created um, they've created an, a provider of type to do. So this provider actually, well, actually it's a state notifier provider which is of type list to do. So what you're trying to do is you're supposed to kind of look at or maybe you're building an app for to-do lists, and you'll have a lot of different to-do lists, and what you want to do whenever someone adds a new list or removes a to-do, you want to update that list of to-dos, right? And that's what basically you can use state provider for, right? That state provider can actually keep track of your to-dos and update the widgets which are actually displaying those to-dos, and you don't have to worry about any of that logic, right? And take for example this, in this scenario, this example creates a state notifier of the type to do, list to do, and then it has some additional, so at the end of it, when it initializes, you'll have empty list. There are no to-do lists, but then there are other methods where you can update the to-do list, you can remove it, you can toggle something as completed. So pretty crazy stuff, right? The other thing very critical to understand is these states are all immutable, right? So you can't modify a state in this scenario would be containing a list of your to-dos, right? So you can't just replace it, or maybe you can't just modify it. You need to completely create a new instance of it and then assign it. So in this scenario, we're using some fancy uh, essentially operator to just create a new list altogether along with the old one, right? So I'm essentially kind of appending the a newly added to do, and in this scenario I'm removing it and I'm toggling it, right? So this is that provider, and then what I can do is wherever I'm displaying this to do and I want it to show the updated list, I'm going to be just calling this reference.watch, and I'm going to have to extend a consumer widget, which is again part of Riverpod. Um, Folks from provider family would understand a little bit the default Flutter provider, but here we are, right? Um, so you can watch this provider that I just created, and now whenever I add something, whenever I remove something, or whenever that state, this object that you see here, right, this gets changed or modified, it'll rebuild this widget, and so that you'll always have updated data, right? Another concept to understand is key on some interaction, right? You would want to update that widget, but essentially calling a watch would not be appropriate because you're just trying to update that entity and not necessarily listen to it, right? So what you can do, you can just read that provider as it's notified specifically, and you can maybe add a new to-do list, delete one of those to-do list, or mark something as done, right? So whenever you're trying to modify something, you'd rather do it through this read method, and whenever you're trying to react to something, right, then you would be using this watch method over whatever provider you have, right? So same concept. In my scenario, I wanted to listen to the changes to the project's working directory, right? So what I did is I created a provider of class of the type state notifier for a string. Right now you might see that there is a huge syntax difference because I'm kind of a lazy person, and I don't want to get into writing even this. I can't be bothered to write even this kind of um, boilerplate code. So what I ended up doing was I used the auto generator for Riverpod. And so for that, I use this annotation that, hey, this is a provider and I want to keep alive this provider. Don't want you to kind of destroy it once it's not anymore in the widget tree. So I want you to kind of keep it alive till the life cycle of the whole app, right? Because of course I want to retain this information of whatever project is selected till the app is running and open, right? And if you see here, I do have that. So if even if I rebuild any of the widgets out here, it will still retain this project directory path, right? And so there you go. So that's that provider. So I created a provider of the type string. If you look at this thing, so that is of the type string, and it's nullable. So whenever I first initialize this widget, it will return me null, meaning I don't have any project selected. And then I can perhaps show some help message that select a project, and then when user clicks on this thing, it will kind of select the project, right? So I have that done here, right? So that's amazing. Next thing what I've done is, well, now I also want to store all the files that I've read so far, right? Or I want to maintain a state of that, right? So for that, I have created another provider, which is called as project files. Project file is nothing but a list of file system entities, right? So when you use the Flutter API to and pick a file, right? It actually returns you a list of a directory path, right? And that directory path is of type file system entity, right? So any file in Flutter actually is of the type or is has the parent file system entity, right? And then this file system entity could be a file, a directory, or a linked file, I would say, or which is what a symbol is in Linux, right? So now since I'm kind of reading files, so I'm going to get a list of file system entities, which will be a collection of directories in that. So it will be collection of all these directories, all these files, right? So which is fair enough. So that's why when I created this provider, right, which is files, and of course I'm going to be keeping it alive. So when I created this provider project files, so what I ended up doing was um, I actually used so this is that build method. So whenever I actually watch this provider, it initializes itself through this build method. And in this build method, then I can define, hey, you need to fetch files, you need to fetch some data from some API, some database. So all that initialization logic is something I can write it in this build method. So I've overridden that build method, right? And now in this scenario, what I want to do is, whenever a file directory is or a project directory is selected, right? So get that project directory path, and then you read all the root level files, right? So the another beautiful thing about Riverpod is that I can actually create interdependent providers, right? So a project files provider actually depends on this project directory path, right? So whenever this path changes, my provider actually also, or this project directory path provider also notifies other providers on which are dependent on it, so they also get updated, so there is no inconsistency in data. That's the amazing part about Riverpod, right? So of course, whenever someone changes the directory, I also want these files to be updated, right? So that's why I've defined in my build method key, hey, this provider also depends on some other provider, right? So if that provider changes, make sure you change yourself too. That's what I'm trying to do here. I'm watching this project directory path provider, and I get this directory path, and I'm seeing if it's not null. Let's load these files. And in this, it's pretty standard Flutter APIs that I'm using here. I'm kind of first fetching the directory. So it'll just create that string object into a directory object, right? And then once I have that directory object, what I would like to do is I'd like to fetch those files for that directory, right? So it'll essentially, this is a synchronous operation. So of course, everything has to be future, right? So it's gonna fetch me a list of files. Right now, the next thing I have done is actually these files would be sorted in some arbitrary order. I don't know what that default order is, but what I want to do is I want to first arrange all these files as at top level. I want to show all the folders, and then I want to show all the files. So I wrote a function that will show all these files at the top, as all these folders at the top in an alphabetic order, and then all the files followed by that in an alphabetic order, right? So that's amazing. So we did that, and then after that, what I want to do is I want to ignore some files here, right? Maybe I don't want to show all those Mac files, right? So if you see what I'm ignoring, yeah, I would like to ignore the get directory. I would like to ignore all these Mac file system specific directory cache files that are just not relevant to that Flutter source code, right? So even like Py cache stuff like that. So I'm kind of going to ignore all these files so they don't show up here and waste a lot of real estate. So once I kind of do that, I have this directory and all the files associated with that directory, right? Now I'm storing it in a map with the intention that every file path that I kind of go exploring, right, would be stored as a key and the list of files as its value, right? Again, key and the files, list of files as value, a key and list of files as value. So the path of that directory which I'm kind of expanding would be key, and the files would be, the list of files would be the value. So in case, because it's the first time I'm opening this directory, you'll have your root directory path and all the files at the root level, and then as I expand each node, this directory will get updated, right? So that's why if you see the type of my provider, it's a map, right? A map of string, and where the values are list of files, right? So that's amazing. That's how I'm kind of storing my files and passing it to this fancy tree, right? Now if we go back, now that we have this provider down, right? Let's see how we have implemented in this widget, right? How do we use this in widget, right? So this is my explorer, project explorer, right? What I've done is, in this particular scenario, I have created a consumer stateful widget, right? That is because I wanted to pass this controller getter, and I was struggling this whole time to, um, I was planning to use, hey, can I just use a, or maybe can I just read a provider here itself, right? And in a way, but I think that was not possible. I was getting a Stack Overflow error, and I raised the issue at the Flutter Fancy repository. But after discussion with the maintainer Matthews, I think he just asked me to perhaps just, he doesn't know why there is this issue with provider. So he suggested me that I just use like a normal stateful widget and just store that project files in a stateful variable. Now that's bit counterintuitive, but I don't have any other way, so we're kind of running along with that. So if someone has a better way to do this, or maybe do it in a river pod way, please do let me know. So by anyways, this is my state. In my state, what trying to do is I'm initiating my controller, right? I'm passing it an empty list because I don't have anything at the root. And simultaneously, I'm also reading my provider, right? And I'm reading so that I can essentially pass the getter of this provider, right? So I've written a getter which is get project files, right? So what I want to do is throughout as I kind of work on this project directory, right? I'm going to be expanding files, directories. So every time I click on this node, I want to show the list of files or the children of this node, right? And I want to have a getter there, right? So what I ended up doing was I just wrote that getter here in my provider itself, right? So you, as I mentioned, right, you can write the operations you want to do on your provider in the provider itself, right? So in this scenario, I wanted to, for a path, I wanted to get all the files or the children in that path, right? So what I've done is I've kind of since my state is a map, right? It's a map of key, which is a directory path and the respective list of files inside that directory as values, right? So what I've done is ki, hey, when you pass me a path, I would return you the list of files contained in that path, right? So that's what I'm doing. I'm checking whether this state value is not null, if that map contains the key, contains the directory. So if it does, I'm going to return all the list of files, and that's how I am able to show key, your view contains this one file, or your lib contains a directory and another file, right? So we have this getter method that we have written, and we are passing that getter method to this tree controller and its children provider, right? So every time I click on this node, this children provider will work its magic, right? Else it will return empty. So that all that stuff I did in my init state, and of course, respectively, I'm also destroying my controller when I'm done with it. But that's that. Right, now let's get into the build method. Let's see what's up. Right, so I'm kind of again watching this provider, right, in the build method. Now since build method actually runs and builds the widget, I can use this watch method and I can react to the changes, right? But I can't do that in an init. I can't react with the interface because by that time the interface is just not yet ready and attached to the tree. So I would just rather read it and get the instance initiated, and then perhaps I can reuse it. But in this scenario, I'm kind of watching this files provider, the project file trees. So what I tend to do again here is key. I'm kind of, when this data fetch is done, right, I'm reading again the root files, and I'm again seeing if those root files are empty, meaning if I select a project directory and there is nothing in that. So I'd just show key, hey, you selected a project directory and there's nothing in it. So that's that. But and if there is something in it, then I'm going to set those roots to the controller, right? Because we initialized this controller with empty root, because of course we didn't have any, right? We'll be reading them in the build method, and then once we do that, we'll update those roots. Right, now we have these roots. Now we can actually build this thing, right? Actually, I would like to use here the tree animated stuff. Tree oh, sorry. So in this fancy Flutter tree library, there is another widget called as tree animated widget. Um, so I just used the tree node widget, but I would like to have a little bit of fancy animation when I expand and collapse this thing. So let's try to do that. Animated. So I'm just trying to recollect animated tree view. Yeah, there you go. So that's it. Nothing else. It's just gonna add some animations to it. But what I next do is I pass my tree controller that I've just set up, and then of course I write a node builder, right, which is actually going to suppose to build these nodes and their children and handle the on-click stuff, right? So what I would like to do is I would be getting a list of files here, right? what I want to show is I want to show appropriate icon for the file. If it's a directory, show a folder icon. If it's a file, show a file icon, I would say. And then yeah, and from a future perspective, from an ID perspective, when I do Git integration at some point, I would like to show all these Git statuses and color these things properly, right? So if I just created a new file, show it in green. If I modified a file, show it in yellow, blue. And if there are any errors in the file, show it in red, stuff like that. So but all those things would go in this node builder. So anyways, this node builder will actually get me a tree entry of type file system, right? So of course we're reading list of files. So in the builder method, I'm gonna get an entry of the type file system entity, right? So I'm gonna get the file that is in this entry, and then I'm gonna see if it's a directory. What you do is you show a directory icon and you accordingly update the method on click, right? On click, I want to fetch list of directories or list of children, and if it's just a file, on click I want to open that file in that editor, right? So that's what we'll do. So what I've done is I've set up a void callback on press, and also maintaining whether the file is open or not. So that's that. So if the file is directory, let's fetch me all the child files, right? And again, I'm reading this thing here. I don't have to watch it, right? I don't have to be reactive. I just want to passively read all the data, right? So I just want to passively get the children. I don't want to be reactive here. So instead of using ref.watch, I'm using ref.need, and I'm using the notifier. And again, the method, the getter method that we use, the same method that we pass to the children, is the method that we're going to use here, which is like file.path. So I'm going to be passing this file.path, and it'll go into the map where I have all the directory paths and the values, the list of children files as values associated, right? So I'm going to be passing that directory, this whatever directory I'm trying to expand, as key, and it will return me all the files, right? So I'm gonna write, if these child files are null, meaning I haven't fetched them yet, they are not there with me, so I need to fetch them. So on created state where I have these newly read files, right? But as you see, this operation happens asynchronously. So since it happens asynchronously, I need to maintain a loading state, right? I want to show a loader here that wait, I'm loading these files, and when it's loaded, it does show those, right? So we'll dive later in a while. But yeah, this is what happens when there is no child later in a while. But yeah, this is what happens when there is no child available for the file that I'm trying to expand, right? I'm going to be fetching those files. I'm going to be setting loading, and then turning it off once I have these files. So that, right? Or else if the child files are empty, that means there is the directory itself is empty. So I'm going to set this press to null. And of course, I'm going to toggle the open status. Else, if I do have those children files with me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the status of the tree to expanded. So before that, I need to kind of get the status of the node, right? Whether this node is expanded or collapsed, right? So I'm going to get the status and store it in a boolean, and then I'm going to set this on press to toggle, right? So whenever someone clicks, it's going to toggle and expand this thing, right? So if there are no files, it'll load. If there are files, it'll just expand itself, right? That's the fun part. So it's gonna expand it now, and then on expansion, again, this is a controller, this is a method available on the controller which is going to change the state of the node of that tree. It's going to expand, it's going to populate a list under that node, and it's going to show you the files contained in that node. So that is what is happening here, right? And yeah, so I've kind of set up all these things. If it's a directory, if there are no files, fetch the files. If there are no child files, fetch the child files. If there are child files, please expand and show them, right? And if it's a file, then what I would like to do is I would just like to open it in an editor, right? So for that, again, I have created a provider, and we'll kind of look into it at some point when we are working on improving the code editor. But right now we're specifically talking about the expansion tree, so I'm just going to talk about that. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so we have got this logic sorted, And then this is where you actually build the interface of that particular row and the tree, right? So this is nothing but this. So this part is pretty easy. I've just defined the way how it looks. So the Flutter fancy tree already provides me with a widget called as tree indentation, sorry, where actually pass it the entry, and then I am using an inkwell here so that this whole thing is clickable, and it shows this beautiful fancy animation, shows animation on hover, and of course on pressed we're gonna do whatever we are supposed to do, and then I'm gonna on the child I'm gonna have to display all this interface, right? So perhaps I might have used a row, an icon, and a piece of text, right? So if you look at this method, right, of course there is a row cross aligned to center, uh, of course you have an icon, and then you have a piece of text, right, which is actually the name of the file. um yeah, and then of course I personally use font awesome, so I've used those widgets here to show, right? So there you go. Okay, so I think so far so good. I think we're kind of happy with that here. Let's go back in this scenario. So yeah, I'm returning this newly designed widget here, which is supposed to show the file name, the icon, any colors, stuff like that, and supposed to behave on click. So that's what we're doing here. Yeah, so far so I think this looks good to me. I think we're kind of already spent good chunk of time on this stream. So what I'd like to do is maybe end the stream here, and perhaps in the next stream, live stream, what I would like to do is we'll see how we can actually maintain this state, right? That I have expanded this folder, and if I close it and reopen it, okay, it shows it collapse, right? Can store that thing, right? So let's see how we do that in the next stream. I did ask Matthews on how to do that, and he just said that maybe you should um, essentially maybe you should extend the existing tree controller and override its method of these expansion state and set expansion state, and in that manner perhaps you'd be able to do that. So we'll try to do it in that fashion and see how it turns out. So there you go. Yeah, so anyways, I think that's it for this stream. Since this is my first stream, I don't know how it's gonna turn out, so I'm gonna kind of maybe end it at this milestone and just review it and see if the audio quality, the internet, and everything seems perfect. And maybe if it is, in future we'll kind of do um extended and much more interactive versions of this thing. But meanwhile, I would encourage you to check out this repository. So this is an open source Flutter IDE. I would like to check out what I'm trying to do different here, how I'm building it. And if you are kind of excited about it and you would like to use this kind of IDE, I would highly recommend that you come and contribute, maybe file an issue, maybe add a feature, maybe add a suggestion, or maybe even help me with the code. That'd be amazing, right? So yeah, there you go. Anyways, this is it for now. The link is in the description for this GitHub repo. Other than that, all right.